Scripture reading this morning comes from Genesis 29, verses 1 through 30. But follow along with me as we read verses 15 to 30. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love that he had for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed." So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban said, "It is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years." Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Have you ever noticed we have a lot of idioms in our culture about the dangers of lying and deception and suffering the consequences of our deceptions? I learned this one at a young age. Maybe you guys learned this too. "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive." Anyone ever learned that one? This tangled web was built on the back of deception. It produces a trap so intricate that there's no way of escaping it. And the lesson is that the liar has created such a complex and tangled web of lies that he's bound to be caught up in it. Perhaps you've heard someone say, "You've made your bed, now you have to lie in it," which is a very weird saying if you just think of like the words at face value. But we get the idea. Someone has done something shady, and now they have to suffer the consequences of their own making. I think these derive basically from biblical principles of sorts. You will reap what you sow. We read in Galatians 6:7. If you plant carrots, you won't harvest potatoes, right? If you plant carrots, you're going to harvest carrots. If you lie, you will reap lies. Or maybe to take this to a deeper spiritual level and not just a principle level, you may be sure your sin will find you out, is what we learn in Numbers 3:23, or 32:23. So what we know is true biblically, we know principally as well. If you sin, there are consequences. Your sin will find you out. Your lies will come back to haunt you and trap you in their web. And what we have today in our passage is a bit of comeuppance for Jacob. Jacob, whose name means trickster or deceiver, he finds himself getting the same treatment that he dished out to Esau and to his father Isaac. He gets manipulated and tricked. The deceiver gets deceived. Now, we know that what drove Jacob was mostly honorable motives, but his actions were still sinful. He wanted the blessings of God. He wanted to receive what God had promised. He wanted to belong to God's covenant, yet he really lacked faith that God was going to carry out his promises in proper time. Just as his father Abraham did on multiple occasions, the man of faith lost faith, or he was slow to believe. But here you have a different scenario, right? Because Jacob has just encountered God at Bethel. God met him as he slept on a rock and showed him a vision of his presence with him and the picture of a stairway to heaven with angels ascending and descending. God has promised to make good on the covenant promises to Abraham that they would come to Jacob, that God would be with Jacob. Jacob would be his covenant heir, and he would receive all the blessings of the covenant promises. And now here's Jacob, who's coming to Haran, as we just read, and though he escaped his brother Esau's wrath, his deceits are going to come back to haunt him. His trickster ways are going to come back on him tenfold. as he will meet a man who's a far more skilled liar and trickster than he is, Laban. So I want to make a few kind of initial observations of the passage, and then we're going to dig into the passage. First is this. The section we're starting this morning actually stretches for the next 3 chapters. So we're kind of pulling out just the first chunk of it, because this really goes on for 3 chapters. And it doesn't really conclude until Jacob flees Laban almost 20 years later. And so these 3 chapters kind of serve 20 years. Second, the temptation with Old Testament passages is always to overly moralize them, to make them just a kind of a simplistic moral lesson, right? So it's like, oh, don't lie. Well, that's not the whole point of the passage. I think it's even more of a temptation in smaller sections like this when there's no overt theological lesson, there's no Christ reference, there's no specific oracle from God. It'd be very easy if at some point in this chapter the skies open up and a voice from heaven shines down and makes a statement. You're like, okay, well, there's the main point. And so we tend to, when those are absent from a particular section, we tend to kind of moralize. Well, maybe the lesson here is just don't lie. Well, I think that's a fair conclusion, but that's not the primary point. I think we can draw both some practical observations for how God deals with his people and also connect it to a larger theological ideas and principles. So to that end, and keeping in mind the principle that our sin has consequences, that our sin will find us out, we reap what we sow, we can start off with a major observation and lesson, and it's this. God himself will bring about necessary discipline and correction by showing us our sin and error. Why point that out now? Well, it isn't the main point, but it is a helpful lesson. And it's seen most clearly by the fact that God has orchestrated this entire scenario to get Jacob to Laban and to teach him a lesson about being a trickster. He's met his match. Laban is way worse or way better at this than he is. The web of deceit that Jacob has weaved was now a noose. And this could be observed as a divine consequence of sin. But that's not all that God has orchestrated here. This whole passage is not just a lesson about don't be a trickster, don't be a liar. This whole passage is actually a parallel to Genesis 24. Do you remember that we looked at several months ago now, it seems like? A highlight of God's sovereignty and providence as Abraham's servant found a wife for Isaac. He found Rebekah. God had promised Abraham many offspring, but at the point in Genesis 24, all he has is Isaac. Isaac is still single, though, with no kids. Isaac's forbidden to marry of the Canaanites. Abraham sends his servant to Haran to find a wife for Isaac, and there he finds Laban and also a wife. Now, Jacob has had this encounter with God and has been promised many offspring, just as Abraham was. But Jacob is, just like his father Isaac, still single with no kids. And Isaac forbids him to marry a Canaanite and sends him to Haran. And who does he meet there? Laban and a wife. It's a parallel passage. The exact same thing is playing itself out. What drives both of them to Haran is the covenant promises of God. If Jacob does not find a wife, there will be no children. No offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky and as numerous as the dust on the earth. There will be no covenant heir, no inheritor of the promises. And so the question that always hangs over us at every moment throughout the Old Testament, specifically in Genesis, is, will this be the end of the covenant promises of God? Right? If this was a daily episodic television show like existed in the 1960s and 70s, where the television show would come to an end and they'd have a big freeze frame and it would be like, will this be the end of the covenant promises? Tune in next week to find out what will happen to, because that's always the question. God has promised these heirs, and yet these people are barren. The women are barren and the men are slow to marry. What's going to happen? Will God fulfill the promises he has given? So there's always this kind of pregnant pause that we're waiting to figure out, well, what's going to happen now? What's next? How's God going to work through this? These people are jacked up. They make bad decisions. How is God working through them? If Jacob doesn't find a wife, there will be no children. There will be no covenant heir. And so Abraham, trusting God, sends his servant to Haran. And this is back in Genesis 24, where does the servant go? To a well. And asking the Lord for guidance, he discovers Rebekah, the sister of Laban, who invites him to his home. Here in Genesis 29, we have Jacob coming to Haran. And where does he find himself? At a well, where he meets Rachel, the daughter of Laban, who invites him to his home. The parallel is there to show us that these stories are to be considered together. The providence of God, this is not just coincidence. This is the providence of God to lead people to these situations where they're showing us the exact same thing. God, if this is what's happened here, maybe God's at work here as well. If this is exactly what happened to Abraham's servant as he's finding a wife for Isaac, and then you find the exact same scenario, well, maybe God's at work over here to provide a wife for Jacob. Parallels there to show us that they can be considered together, but they can also be contrasted. What's different in the story? Well, notably, Abraham tells his servant, the Lord will send his angel before you. The servant gets to the well and prays for guidance. When he discovers Rebekah, he worships the Lord. The message of Genesis 24 is clear. God in his providence has led Abraham's servant to Rebekah as a wife for Isaac. But what's interesting is in Genesis 29, all that language is missing. The setting's the same. The situation's the same. The characters, Laban's the same, and the characters are just the next generation. Everything is set up the exact same, but there's not that language of trusting in the providence of God. There's not that language of Jacob praying and thanking God for revealing a wife. He doesn't worship the Lord in thanksgiving. We're left wondering if Jacob's going to go back to his old scheming ways, where he trusts his plan and denies God's plans. So you have the Lord leading Jacob to a place where the deceiver gets played before he can execute his own scheme. And this is the undeniable truth of the passage. God is always there and is always guiding and orchestrating events for his people. And here's the part that's hard for us to understand. He's always guiding and orchestrating events, even when it seems like we've messed up the entire thing. Even when you look at it and go, man, what a wreck of a end result is this? Yet God has orchestrated events. I mean, we thought Jacob learned that at Bethel, right? We thought Jacob learned that God was always with him. That was the whole lesson of Genesis 28, that God has encountered, or God has come to Jacob, and he's shown him himself a vision while he sleeps of a stairway with angels ascending and descending. And the lesson to Jacob is, wherever you are, there I am with my presence. Just like you would be on the mountain of God, here's showing you, there's always a mountain of God. The mountain of God is traveling with you. I am with you in your presence. You are with me in my presence, more specifically. Has Jacob already forgotten that? I mean, maybe Jacob is wanting to scheme to get what he wants, a wife, an offspring, and then God has to teach him some lessons. Well, so I think there's a couple lessons here. One, the sinfulness and foolishness of trickery as Jacob gets tricked. But not just in the sense that lying is bad. We know that. That's the moral law of God. We know that we shouldn't lie. So it's not just that kind of lesson, but that God is not going to have his plans fooled or accomplished just by your trickery or Jacob's trickery. God is not needing Jacob to pull off a scheme to get this done. And this is a constant problem for the people of God here in Genesis, right? They're constantly wanting to accomplish the things of God by the power of man. God shows the sinfulness of such mindset. And then the flip side of that is that he shows the utter faithfulness of himself to carry out his plan and promise, that even amongst scheming and lying, nothing can stop it. So man's schemes can't accomplish God's plan, and man's schemes can't stop God's plan. The Lord can use even human sin, even with its immediate consequences, to carry out his greater redemptive plan. So with that theme in mind, let's walk through the narrative. And as I like to do with these historical passages, I like to break them up into kind of episodes, little scenes. It helps me keep track of the flow of the passage, so I hope it helps you. This passage has three scenes. You have the arrival in verse 1 through 8, the meeting in verse 9 through 14, and the deception in verse 15 through 30, which we read earlier. Starting off with the arrival in the first 8 verses. Jacob has left the land. He's sent by Isaac and Rebekah to Haran to find a wife. He's encountered God at Bethel, and he's been promised by God that he would be with him wherever he goes, even to Haran. Part of that promise was a reiteration of the promise for offspring, that there would be numerous as the dust of the earth. And we pick up there as Jacob leaves Bethel. Look at verse 1 of chapter 29. And then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. The journey was a month-long journey, by the way. And even though he was in exile from the land of promise, God was with him as he journeyed. Look at verse 2. As he looked, he saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. For out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large. And when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of the well. It seems like some weird commentary thrown in here, right, about them using this well this way, but it'll come back to play later on. I learned this recently, that the stone was there to keep the well from filling with sand. If they left the stone off, the well would dry up because sand would blow into it, fall into it, and would dry up the well. So they stood ready to put the stone in place, right? So they'd roll away the stone, and they'd get water from it, and then they'd roll back the stone. Now, you may be thinking, I know what Jason's going to do with this. He's a biblical theology guy. This is where Christ is. It's the rolling away the stone at the temple. It has nothing to do with that. Put your mind at ease that now we're not coming back later at the end like, just as the stone was rolled away from the tomb. No, not just happens to be a stone put in place of a well. That's all, right? Same language, not the same idea. Okay, just getting that out of the way before you're like, I know where he's going to go. You're already filling in your last point on your worship guide, right? In your notes. No. Jacob arrives and sees these flocks and approaches this well, hoping to find the people of his grandfather Abraham, right? That's why he's been sent. He's been sent to find a wife from the people of his grandfather, not from the people of the land that they're in, not in the Canaanites. The Canaanites were rejectors of God, rejectors of the covenant of God. He was sent by his parents to go find a wife from among their own people. And that's where he is. He's hoping to find them. So look at this in verse 4. Jacob said to them, my brothers, where do you come from? Right? He's basically asking, who do you belong to? They said, we are from Haran. He said to them, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, we know him. He said to them, is it well with him? They said, it is well. Basically, he's asking, are they alive? Is he alive? Is he okay? Is it well with him? They said, it is well. And see, Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep. I remind you again how this story sounds like the story of Abraham's servant to come to this land to find Isaac a wife. The Lord led the servant directly to a well, and while he was at the well, Genesis 24:12 says that he prayed fervently for the Lord to lead him to the right woman, and when he opened his eyes, he saw Rebekah. Before he even finished praying, God led him to Rebekah, and Rebekah to him, right there at the well. The way she served this servant and watered his camels proved she was the one. Now, here is the son of Rebekah coming to the same well. He doesn't have the caravan of wealth that the servant brought. He's alone. But the Lord led him to the exact spot he wanted him. As I noted earlier, Jacob did not pray for guidance. He didn't thank God for his providence in leading him to this place. He didn't, when he get to the well, ask God to reveal a wife. It seems Jacob is taking matters into his own hands again. His questions are not of God. His questions are of these shepherds. Hey, how's Laban? Is he alive? What's going on? Is it well with him? Jacob encounters these shepherds, and when they confirm they're from Haran, and he asks about Uncle Laban, a man he's never met but surely heard about from his mother. They point that his daughter Rachel is off in the distance making her way to the well because she's a shepherdess. And Jacob again seems to want to take matters in his own hands, and he seeks to send them away. Look at verse 7. He said, behold, it's still high day. It's not time for the livestock to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go, pasture them. But they said, we cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep. Perhaps some commentators say this is just Jacob making a ploy to get Rachel alone. Could be. But he does call these shepherds out for their laziness. I don't know if you catch that there. He's basically going, what are you guys doing here this early? You should still be out in the field. It's not time for you to water the flocks and put them up. You're being lazy. What are you doing hanging around the well? And their response is kind of defensive. They're like, well, we have to wait until someone rolls away this stone so we can water the sheep. And evidently the custom was to wait until all the flocks were gathered so they could be watered at one time together. So they only had to roll the stone because evidently the stone was large and they had to move it out of the way. And so they waited for the shepherds to get there with all the flocks so that they could water all the flocks together and then put the stone back in place, and then everyone would go their own way. These guys just cut short the pasture time to get in line for water first, is essentially what's going on here. The earlier they get the sheep water, the earlier their day comes to an end. And that's the end of section 1. That's the first episode. Jacob is now in the land of the people of his grandfather. He's been sovereignly led by God to this well, to a bunch of lazy shepherds, and to the place where he might find a wife. Now we have the second episode, Jacob meeting Rachel. And I want you to notice this phrase in verse 9. Look at this in verse 9. While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Now, it's a similar phrase to when Abraham's servant was praying, and it says, and while he was still praying, Rebekah arrives on the scene. So while he's still speaking with the shepherds, enter Rachel. She's a shepherdess. Her name means ewe lamb. Tending to her father's sheep, she approaches the well as Jacob speaks. But Jacob doesn't give thanks like the servant does. He goes into man mode. He performs a feat of strength to prove his manliness, to impress the beautiful woman. Look at verse 10. I love this. She walks up to the place. And now as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. So this stone that was meant to be, that the shepherds would wait for 2 or 3 of them to roll away, Jacob's like, I got this, and rolls it away himself, trying to impress beautiful Rachel. Isn't that interesting? You know, we told you before that Esau was a hunter, and Jacob was what we'd call indoorsy. But that doesn't mean he was a wimp. Clearly here, he's not weak. He was inside getting strong, right? He was inside lifting weights. He moves this big rock by himself, waters the flocks of Laban by himself, and then he tells Rachel who he is, like beating his chest. Look at this. Look at what I did. Huh? That's kind of his response, huh? Look at verse 11. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. Bold move. Bold move. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. Now, this is not, she was like upset at this. She was running away in excitement. She's like, this man God has just delivered to me at a well. We're going to go tell my father. I assume at this point the shepherds are kind of watching with amazement that he did this by himself. Jacob kisses Rachel. The only instance, by the way, in Scripture of a man kissing a woman who was not his wife or a relative. If commentators are correct. I didn't check up on that, but I thought it was very interesting that this is not like a common custom is the point. It wasn't a custom like, this is showing that he is showing some sort of affection to her that was uncommon. She was evidently impressed. She was not disgusted by that show of affection in any way. She was impressed by him. They say curls get the girls. And he rolled away they say that, right? That's what I've heard. He rolled away the giant stone out of the way so the flocks could drink. She was enamored by him. She ran and told her father. And he came to meet this relative. She wasn't hesitant about him in the least. Here comes this potential husband for her, and she immediately goes and runs and tells her father. Verse 13, as soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh, and he stayed with him a month. Why was Laban so excited? Was it simply because he wanted to marry off his daughter? No, I don't think so. Maybe because the last time someone from Abraham's family arrived, he brought great riches to Laban. And so he's thinking, part 2 of all the riches. The servant showed up with camels and an entourage, but Jacob showed up by himself, haggard after a month-long journey by himself. When it says here that he told him all these things, he gave him the whole story, is basically what it means. He was the chosen son, but he was on the run and came to find a wife and currently had no home, no money, no possessions. Maybe Laban even thought Jacob was a little bit crazy when he told him of the vision at Bethel. But hey, Abraham had a vision too, and he left the land based on it. So like grandfather, like grandson. And Laban says, this is my bone and my flesh. Now this statement reminds us of Adam, doesn't it? In the garden when God gives him Eve, and this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. I think this is more than just, hey, this is my nephew. What if Laban, hearing the story of Jacob tricking Esau and Isaac, sees a kindred spirit, a fellow trickster, a deceiver? That brings us to the last section, the deception. Jacob has chosen to stay with Laban, and he's been there a month. Certainly in the course of a month, you grow to have some fondness for one another. Obviously, Rachel was quickly enamored with the strong foreign guy coming back to their home. You'd think Laban would grow with some affection towards his nephew. Look at verse 15. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be? Now, if any of you are ever staying with your relatives long term and you're working for them with them and they stop and ask you, hey, tell me what your wages should be, you might want to learn a lesson here. They could be tricking you into marrying two of their daughters. Could be. Because you read this and you think, oh man, Laban's being generous. Laban has looked at this nephew, his blood, who's been working for him for a month, laboring away, and goes, man, I can't let you work for free. You got to have something. Tell me what it is that you want. So I think our immediate response is to think Laban is doing this out of the generosity of his heart. Man, you are my relative. I can't just work you for nothing. Tell me what it is you want. Name your price. But he isn't just wanting to pay money to his hardworking nephew. He's working an angle. He's about to deceive the deceiver. He knows that Jacob is strong and works hard, and not just that, he knows that Jacob loves Rachel. He knows that Rachel loves him. He also knows that Jacob has no possessions and no money, which means he has no ability to pay the dowry price that would be required to gain Rachel in marriage. Spoiler alert, this would be their relationship for the next 20 years. Not uncle and nephew, but employer and employee, more like an indentured servant, seeking to pay off the bride price. Laban exploits his blood relative. He does not help him. And verse 15 ends with Laban asking for a wage price, but the writer of Genesis cuts off that wage negotiation to enter into the record some very important information for us. Look at verse 16. Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. There's two daughters. We've already met Rachel, but now we're introduced to the older daughter, Leah. Rachel's name means ewe lamb, female lamb. What a beautiful sound, right? The beautiful picture of a baby lamb. That's Rachel. Leah, likely her name means cow. So beautiful lamb, heifer. That's the, you hear these two things, that's what you're supposed to hear. And sadly, this contrast played itself out further than just their names. Leah has weak eyes, which what this means exactly, we're unsure. Some say it means it lacked any kind of sparkle or fire, which would be a prized attribute. Rachel, on the other hand, was beautiful in every way, in form and appearance. It was her who caught Jacob's eye immediately, and Leah was just there. What would be his employment price? Jacob's like, the one I love, Rachel. He would work to gain her hand in marriage. He would work to build up a dowry price for her father. She was worth the hard work. That was Jacob's offer. Why? Because Jacob loved her. Look at verse 18. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. Stay with me. Basically, this one, he's agreeing to the price. These are the wages. So he's worked a system, he's worked a situation where Jacob has offered up, I'll give you 7 years, 7 years of hard work for your daughter's hand in marriage. Laban agrees. And you get this beautiful statement in verse 20. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Oh, isn't that sweet? It's like when someone tries to explain relativity and they said if you're with the one you love, a day goes by in an instant, and when you're apart, each day feels like an eternity. This is Jacob's existence right now. For Laban, this was a great deal. He got 7 years of labor and also married his daughter off to a kinsman. For Jacob, his love for Rachel made the 7 years fly by. What a beautiful love story. He met her at a well. They were going to tell this story forever, right? Well, we met at a well. I rolled away a big stone. I flexed real quick. She ran off and told her dad. I then said, here's what I will do for her hand. I'm not just going to ask for her hand in marriage. I will work 7 years because that's how much I love her. I'll work 7 years to gain her hand in marriage. This is what they're going to tell all their kids. There's their beautiful love story. They were going to Insta this whole thing. They're going to engrave, make shirts. They're going to hashtag it, love at a well, love well, hashtag, I don't know what the. Beautiful love story. Like a plot to a Nicholas Sparks novel. And they all lived happily ever after. But no, that isn't what happened. Look at verse 21. Then Jacob said to Laban, this is at the end of the 7 years. Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. Jacob got duped. The deceiver got deceived. Laban tricked him. At the end of his 7 years, it appears that Laban may have been dragging his feet to carry out his end of the bargain. He did the same when it was his sister's time to go to Isaac, right? But Jacob demands his bride, and Laban relents. He throws us an elaborate wedding feast. And by the way, when we hear these kind of feasts, we should understand that some ways they're described in the literature is that they are like a drinking banquet. I think we're told that it's that type of feast because it helps explain why Jacob cannot tell the difference between a lamb and a heifer. These wedding feasts often lasted a full week, but tradition holds that the bride is veiled on the first day, and at the end of the first day, at the end of the day, the groom would grab his cloak and wrap it around his veiled bride and take her into his tent where the wedding was consummated. So it's dark as Egypt outside. It's dark inside the tent. She's veiled. Then he has his cloak over her to take her away. It's actually kind of easy to see how he might be confused, especially if he's been drinking all day. Laban knew this. And Laban took advantage. We're told that Laban, not during the ceremony, but during the festivities, switched the women under the veil, so that when Jacob took his bride to his tent in the dark, the veil over her face, the cloak covering her, with too many drinks in him from the party, he was unable to tell it was Leah and not Rachel. It was only when the sun was up and shining into the tent that the ploy was revealed. And I love how it says, behold, it was Leah. Now the woman he loved was not his wife, it was her homely sister, and it could not be undone. Look at the end of verse 25. In the morning, behold, it was Leah, and Jacob said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? Laban said, it is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Laban's like, hey, this is our tradition. Of course, Jacob was probably thinking, well, why didn't you tell me this 7 years ago? Laban pulled off the trick. He married off his ugly daughter under the guise of his pretty daughter being the one married off. But perhaps Jacob recognized the irony of him complaining to Laban about being tricked. Why then have you deceived me? This is the same exact phrase that Esau said to him when he tricked Esau. Jacob's sin had found him out. And now he was suffering as the victim of his own web of deceit, his own trickery. He was feeling the hurt and the anger. Unlike Esau, who cared nothing for his birthright, Jacob actually loved Rachel deeply. So his misery was actually compounded of Esau. And in a reverse judgment, whereas in his family the older would serve the younger as promised by God, here he's tricked into taking the older and not the younger. There's a type of judgment being played out here, a lesson to the nature of his treachery and trickery. Laban says, you may have taken the right of the firstborn from your brother, but we don't do that here. We don't place the younger above the older. Jacob tricked his father into giving him the blessing of the firstborn, and now he was tricked into taking the firstborn. What goes around comes around. You reap what you sow. But what can be done? Today, people would go, listen, it was Vegas. Let's get this thing annulled. Not so in the ancient Near East. Look at verse 27. Laban says, this is not our custom. We can't give the younger before the firstborn. That was verse 26. Verse 27, complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years. So basically what he's saying is, finish out this week, which is the wedding feast. Finish out this wedding to Leah, and then I will give you Rachel at the end of the week, and then for the next 7 years, you will serve me to make up for what I've already given you in Leah and Rachel. Does that make sense of how the timing of this? That's the deal that Laban offers. Will Jacob accept it? Laban will make him wait out this whole time, and then another 7 years, 14 years of working, 14 years of labor to get the one wife that he thought he worked for the first 7 years for. Oh, and also Leah. What choice does he have? The deceiver was deceived. He loved Rachel. And Laban won the battle. So he goes along with the plan. Look at verse 28. Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave from his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. Now, those little parenthetical statements in verse 24 and 29 about the female servants, they'll come back to play next week. That's why they're thrown in there. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. And you see here how the trickery of Laban led to the covenant son being a polygamist and also showing favoritism to one over the other. He brought into it the same family deceit, the same family drama that Isaac and Rebekah were trying to get him to avoid. Because remember that Esau had married 2 women. And they were causing distress for their entire family. And so here you have, they're sending off Jacob, go marry. And Laban has done damage to this entire thing. Jacob had his prize, but he got more than he bargained for. And these 7 years did not fly by. They were tedious. They were hard. You see, the wreckage of Jacob's lies have him away from the promised land, away from his mother, who he will never see again, away from the promises of God, and now he has family strife, 4 women in his household, 2 of whom he's married to, 1 of whom he loves, the other who he tolerates, and strife is only going to get worse when children come along. It wasn't that long ago that Jacob was meeting with God in a vision at Bethel where God promised his presence with them, and I'm sure that seems like a distant memory to Jacob at this point. Where was God? Why hadn't he stopped this trickery? God, if you're here, how come Laban was able to pull this thing off? If you were promising, if you're going to give me a wife, how come I end up with 4 women here? How does this happen? God, why didn't you protect me? Have you abandoned me? And here's where that parallel to Genesis 24 is so helpful. Because it isn't as if in Genesis 24, when the servant is looking to honor God, that God is therefore then present in providence with him. And thus, in Genesis 29, when Jacob is looking to serve himself, that God is not present in providence, that God is not orchestrating events. It's that even when Jacob is not seeking to honor God, even when Jacob is looking to work an angle, God is still, in the midst of that, working out what he wants to see done. And you go, is this really what God wants to see done? You go, well, not in the sense that this is glorifying to God in the immediate events, but that ultimately God will carry out his promises, even in the midst of human deception and trickery and sin. In the midst of all this stuff, God has been at work. The lesson of the Stairway to Heaven vision was that God was with Jacob wherever he went, that the meeting place of God was not a physical mountain, but that God would always be with Jacob, even in Haran, even in slavery for the people of Israel in years to come. This would be a lesson that would help the people of God in time of need over and over again throughout their history. God didn't dwell only in Jerusalem. God's people were not left alone, even in exile outside the land. Be it in Babylon or in Egypt or in Rome, God was near his people. The providence of God doesn't have a singular location, nor does it take a day off, nor does it have lapses in judgment. So Jacob was learning the glorious truth that God was always with them. And it seemed easy when he was by himself, asleep on a stone pillow in the middle of the desert. It seemed easy for him to take comfort in, oh, God's with me here. But now here's Jacob. He's just been tricked. He now has 4 women in his household. Is he going to believe that God's with him here too or not? Is he going to reject God and be just like his brother Esau? Or is he going to trust God that even in the midst of his own stupidity, even in the midst of his own gullibility, even in the midst of his own sinfulness, that God is still with him? You see, this was a lesson that that Jacob needed to learn. It's a lesson that God's people always need to learn. God was not absent here. His silent presence is working out his plans even amid the sinful plans of man. Jacob was learning the lesson his son Joseph would eventually learn. In Genesis 50, what Laban meant for evil, God meant for good. God was going to fulfill his promises of many offspring, even through imperfect and sinful means and situations. Jacob couldn't see it, but the hand of providence was always working. Friends, this is true for us as well. We are his children. He is working in us in ways that we cannot fully see. And maybe not until long after it's past. And maybe not even this side of glory do we understand how God was at work. Because all we see is our present circumstances. And our response is, God, I got tricked. This isn't what you promised. This can't be right. Laban did me wrong. This can't be what you want. This can't be right. I'm suffering injustice right now. And our response is always, I've been wronged, I've been wronged, I've been wronged. Our response is never to open our eyes a little bit and to stop and see, how is God working even in us being wronged to work out his glory? We forget that God is providentially sovereign over all things, even every event of our life. And we don't trust him. Friends, he has you here for a reason. He has you where you are in your life for a reason. And he is working his purposes in you for good and for his glory, even when it doesn't feel like it. Even when you can't see it. Even when you can never explain it. Even if it's going to be years from now or not even until you're in glory and you see the end result. He's working in you now. Jacob was learning that his plans were coming to nothing. His schemes were not always going to work. Up until the point of him being in exile, his schemes always worked, right? I'm gonna defeat Esau. Bingo, I win. I'm going to defeat my dad. Bingo, I win. He's always coming up aces, and then here he's not. It's easy to desire the plans and promises of God when everything's going well, but now he's been deceived and tricked, and everything's falling apart. Is he going to believe the promises of God then? He's exiled. He's on the run 1,000 miles away from home. He came to get a wife. He's tricked into getting 2. Gets thrown in 2 more women. And we'll soon see that his plan to have children with Rachel will be thwarted by God's power to open and close wombs. Jacob must learn the lesson the hard way, that God is sovereign. His ways are not accomplished through human schemes and effort. And also that God uses imperfect people and imperfect means to accomplish his perfect will. And that it's rarely the way that we would do it. I mean, think about this. Through this situation that we've just witnessed, this absurd trickery of Laban will come about through these 2 wives and their 2 servants, all the 12 tribes of Israel. These are the mothers of the 12 tribes of Israel. These 4 women that we just read today. We'll talk about this next week. Though unloved and unwanted, Leah and her maid Zilpah, 8 of the 12 tribes. The kingly tribe, Judah, the priestly tribe, Levi, Leah's sons. From her would come Moses and David. Through Leah, unwanted by her husband, would come the Messiah, unwanted by the world. Isn't it amazing that God uses sinful schemes and deceptions of men to carry out his plans, and nothing can thwart him? Judas would scheme to kill Jesus with the priests and scribes, false testimony and Roman treachery would put him to death. His closest friends would lie and deny him. Yet none of that thwarts God's plans. In fact, it's through these deceptions and treacherous dealings that God carries out the greatest blessing on humanity, salvation through Jesus Christ. You know, at the end of Genesis, Jacob has 70 offspring. And you go, man, that's a lot of offspring. But he was promised as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the earth, the dust on the earth. It's a far cry from that. A great blessing, sure, but not full fulfillment. Jacob might have felt God's promises were on hold, but God was at work so that through the Messiah who was to come, that all the promises he made to Jacob would actually come to pass. And God used Laban's trickery to get us there. And God used an unwanted, forgettable-looking older sister to bring it about. From her offspring would come the one of whom it's written, Revelation 5, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." It's through the offspring of Jacob and Leah, and thus even from Laban, that Jesus would come and fulfill the promise of innumerable offspring. It's through Jesus redeeming his bride through the new covenant community of faith that the gospel message goes to the end of the earth, and thus the promise to Jacob that through his offspring all the families of the earth shall be blessed was fulfilled. God is fulfilling his promises even while Jacob is laboring under the sinful yoke of an evil uncle. The stairway to heaven, the ladder to God, was never far from him. It was just unseen, as it always was. God was always working. God was always faithful. God was always present. God was always near him. Brothers and sisters, God was working in this treachery to get the gospel to you and me. We are the recipients of the providence of God in this situation. We are the descendants of Jacob that are innumerable, who have been saved by his offspring, Jesus, the Lion of Judah, the son of Leah. You may be tempted to think that God is silent or idle, or that he's forgotten about you, or that he's not at work in your life. You may be tempted to believe, even worse, that he is angry with you and you're under his thumb. But if you are a child of his, you belong to him. You've been saved by him. He's not working against you, he's working for you. You're working against you. Your treachery is what brings the problems to you. Your deceit is what comes back on you. God is working in the midst of that for your good. You may feel like you're alone and forgotten. Maybe you feel like you're overlooked. Maybe you feel a little bit like Leah. This passage reminds us that God is never inactive, never asleep at the wheel, never forgetful. He's always working out his plan. Even when all we see from our human perspective is sinful plans and treacherous dealings and lies and cheatings and tricks and schemes, even among them, God is working out his plan. Don't get discouraged, brothers and sisters. The Lord always fulfills his promises. He is always near his people. He's always working his sovereign will and plan. Even when Jacob is learning his lesson, even when Laban is cheating the chosen son, even when Leah is forgotten, even when Rachel gets caught in the scheme, even then God is at work. Do not think he forgets you. He has worked through this dirty scheme to get us to the Messiah and eventually to save you and to save me. Do you think if he's worked through all those schemes to get us to the Messiah, to get us to salvation for us, that he will then forget us? That he will then forsake us? He's worked through all this to save us. Church, his presence is near. So trust him. Let's pray. Father God, you are gracious to us in ways that we can't even see. You are near to us, though we feel you are far. Lord, maybe the reason of our feeling of distance is not because you're actually far from us, but because we have sinned and we have turned our back to you. Lord, I ask for your grace in causing us to repent of our sin and turn again to you, to see your hand at work. Lord, convict us of our sin. Show us the truth of the gospel in Jesus Christ, the salvation that we have given to us freely through Jesus. Give us faith, give us repentance, and then remind us again of your mercy and nearness. Remind us of your providence. Remind us that regardless of our circumstance or situation, you are good, you are holy, and that you love your people through your Son Christ. You've given us your Spirit. We ask all these things in the name of Christ. Amen.